The truth about narcissistic relationships is that they leave people asking questions long after the relationship has already ended. One of the most common questions that lingers in the quiet hours is this: does the narcissist ever feel ashamed of how they treated me? It's a completely understandable question to ask because when you've poured your heart, your trust, and your emotional energy into someone who kept dismissing your feelings, twisting your reality, or making you doubt your own worth, you naturally want to believe that one day they'll realize the damage they caused. But truly, understanding narcissistic behavior means separating hope from reality. Shame, guilt, regret, and genuine accountability are not the same thing at all, and mixing up these different emotions can keep you emotionally tied to someone who is simply not capable of giving you the closure you deserve. The point of our discussion today isn't to help you understand the narcissist so you can somehow fix them. It's to help you understand them so you can finally set yourself free. Education is one of the strongest forms of emotional protection you can have. The more clearly you see what's happening beneath the surface, the less likely you are to take their behavior personally or blame yourself for the pain they caused. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissism is that narcissists never feel shame at all. The reality is actually far more complicated than that. At the core of many narcissistic personalities sits a deep, hidden fear of being exposed as inadequate, flawed, or unworthy. Emotionally healthy people can admit their imperfections without feeling completely shattered by them. They understand that making a mistake doesn't define their whole identity or worth as a human being. A narcissist, though, often experiences flaws and mistakes in a very different way. To them, admitting they hurt someone can feel like admitting they are fundamentally broken. Because that feeling is so deeply threatening to them, they build powerful psychological defenses just to avoid facing it. Instead of simply saying they made a mistake, they convince themselves that someone else caused the problem. Instead of feeling vulnerable, they turn defensive. Instead of accepting responsibility, they rewrite the whole story. This is exactly why people who have been in relationships with narcissists often end up so confused. They expect the same emotional process they'd go through if they had hurt someone, but narcissistic defenses cut that process short long before real accountability can ever happen. When shame starts to surface inside them, it rarely looks like sadness or honest remorse. Instead, it often shows up disguised as anger, criticism, blame, or a sudden need for control. This is one of the most important things to understand because many survivors mistake these reactions for confidence or total indifference. In reality, these behaviors work as a kind of emotional armor. Picture looking into a mirror that reflects every hurtful thing you've ever done. A healthy person might feel uneasy staring at that reflection, but eventually they can accept it and grow from it. A narcissist often can't stand to look at that reflection at all. Instead of changing themselves, they try to shatter the mirror. They criticize the people who challenge them, attack anyone who tries to hold them accountable, spread damaging rumors, or paint themselves as the innocent victim in the whole situation. None of this is a sign of emotional strength. It's a clear sign of emotional avoidance. The louder they blame everyone else, the harder they may be working to bury the shame they simply can't face. Understanding this doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does help explain why real change is so rare with these people. Many people spend years hoping the narcissist will finally apologize, admit the truth, or acknowledge the deep pain they caused. While genuine apologies happen naturally in healthy relationships, they're much rarer once narcissistic patterns are firmly set in place. Feeling ashamed is never the same as taking responsibility. Someone may privately feel discomfort, embarrassment, or even regret, while still flatly refusing to admit they were wrong. Why does this happen? because facing the truth threatens the carefully built image they've spent years protecting no matter the cost. Instead of apologizing, they might downplay your pain, justify what they did, or insist you got everything wrong from the beginning. They may even flip the story and accuse you of being the abusive one. This can leave survivors doubting their own memories, wondering if they imagined the abuse in the first place. This is exactly why education matters so much for your healing. Once you recognize these patterns for what they truly are, you stop expecting accountability from someone whose emotional survival depends on avoiding it completely. You stop wasting years waiting for words that may never arrive. One of the most surprising truths of this whole journey is that your own healing can actually become one of the clearest reminders of their hidden shame. When you stop chasing them, stop defending yourself, stop arguing, and start rebuilding your confidence, you quietly step out of the role they always expected you to play. Narcissistic relationships tend to rely heavily on emotional dependence. They expect you to keep chasing their approval, explaining yourself over and over, or hoping they'll finally become the person you always believed they could be. But when you start living peacefully without them, something powerful shifts. Your growth becomes undeniable proof that their control no longer has a hold on you. You become a living reminder that their version of events was never the full truth. This doesn't mean they'll suddenly confess everything they did to you. In many cases, they might become even more dismissive, more critical, or even try to work their way back into your life through hoovering tactics. These reactions aren't necessarily proof of love or real remorse on their part. More often, they simply show how uncomfortable they are with losing the influence they once had over you. Maybe the biggest lesson of all is that your healing can never depend on someone else's self-awareness. Waiting for a narcissist to admit they hurt you puts your entire emotional future in the hands of someone who has shown again and again that they cannot offer you emotional safety. That's an incredibly painful place to be stuck in, but it's also one you have every power to walk away from. Your worth was never tied to their apology. Your truth was never tied to their agreement. Your recovery was never something they needed to give you permission to begin. The strongest form of closure isn't hearing them finally admit they were wrong. The strongest form of closure is reaching the point where those words simply aren't needed for your peace of mind anymore. That's true emotional freedom. That's the moment you take your identity back. And that's the exact moment the relationship finally loses its grip on you for good. When you put your energy into understanding yourself instead of trying to figure out why they refuse to change, you start building a life shaped not by the pain they caused, but by the strength, wisdom, and resilience you found while working through it. That's a victory no narcissist can ever take from you. Have you ever lain awake at night wondering if the person who hurt you ever thinks about what they did? Maybe you replay conversations again and again in your mind, searching for the exact moment everything shifted. Maybe you ask yourself whether they ever feel guilt, regret, or shame for the way they manipulated you, brushed off your feelings, or made you question your own reality. These questions are incredibly common among people who have gone through narcissistic relationships because emotional abuse rarely ends with clear, satisfying answers. Instead, it leaves behind a thick fog of confusion, lingering self-doubt, and a strong desire to understand what actually happened. But before we can properly answer whether a narcissist feels shame, we first need to understand what shame actually is and how it truly differs from guilt and accountability. These words get thrown around interchangeably in everyday conversation, but psychologically, they describe very different inner experiences. Healthy shame is an uncomfortable emotional signal that tells us we've acted in a way that goes against our core values. It encourages reflection, empathy, and personal growth. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Healthy accountability says, I recognize the harm I caused, I take full responsibility, and I want to make things right. These emotional processes help people repair relationships and grow into better versions of themselves over time. They require real humility, honesty, and a willingness to sit with deeply uncomfortable emotions instead of running from them. Most emotionally healthy people are capable of this, even though the process is never easy. Narcissistic personalities often struggle enormously with this process because their entire emotional world is built around protecting a fragile sense of self. While they may look intensely confident, superior, or even untouchable on the outside, many psychologists explain that this outward image mainly serves as a defense against deep feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. To someone with strong narcissistic traits, admitting fault can feel less like acknowledging a simple mistake and more like admitting they are worthless at their core. That feeling becomes so threatening that the mind automatically builds heavy defenses to push shame away before it can ever be consciously felt. This is exactly why people often end up so confused after confronting a narcissist about hurtful behavior. Instead of hearing that they're right and getting a sincere apology, they hear endless excuses, blame, denial, or counterattacks. The conversation suddenly shifts to become entirely about your flaws instead of their harmful actions. They might insist you completely misread the situation, accuse you of being far too sensitive, or claim everything was your fault right from the start. None of these reactions are signs of emotional maturity. They're protective strategies designed to keep painful self-reflection safely out of reach. Understanding this difference matters enormously for your peace of mind because many survivors mistakenly believe that if they could just explain themselves more clearly, offer more proof, or stay patient long enough, the narcissist would eventually understand the pain they caused. Unfortunately, real emotional insight can't be forced onto someone whose defenses exist entirely to avoid it. The more directly their behavior threatens their carefully built self-image, the more likely they are to turn defensive instead of reflective. This realization can feel heavy and disappointing at first, but it's also deeply freeing once it truly sinks in. It means their refusal to acknowledge your pain is not proof that your experience wasn't real. It's not evidence that you deserved the mistreatment or that you failed to communicate well with them. Most of the time, it simply shows their deep inability to handle the emotional discomfort that genuine accountability demands. Once you grasp that key difference, you stop measuring your self-worth by whether they're willing to admit the truth. Instead, you start trusting your own lived experience, honoring your own healing, and recognizing that real closure doesn't always come from another person's apology. Sometimes closure simply comes from understanding why that apology may never come and choosing to move forward with your life regardless. That subtle but powerful shift in perspective is exactly where true emotional freedom starts for you. One of the most confusing parts of recovering from narcissistic abuse is watching the dramatic, unpredictable reactions that follow even the smallest bit of accountability. You might calmly point out something hurtful they said, remind them of a promise they broke, or explain how their actions affected your well-being, fully expecting a mature and thoughtful conversation in return. Instead, they suddenly turn angry, defensive, dismissive, or even outright cruel. In some cases, they'll raise their voice, accuse you of attacking them unfairly, bring up mistakes you made years earlier, or completely change the subject to knock you off balance. To someone who has never faced these toxic patterns before, these reactions can feel completely irrational and confusing. But, seen through the lens of narcissistic defense mechanisms, they start to make a lot more sense. What often looks like unshakable confidence or emotional strength on the surface is actually a desperate, frantic attempt to escape feelings they simply cannot face. One of those deeply buried feelings is shame. Shame is one of the most painful emotions any human being can experience because it doesn't just tell us we made a mistake. It whispers deep down that something is fundamentally wrong with who we are. Emotionally healthy people can usually separate their specific actions from their overall identity without falling apart. They understand that making poor choices doesn't automatically make them permanently bad or unworthy people. This healthy mindset lets them apologize sincerely, learn real lessons, and grow as individuals without feeling emotionally wrecked in the process. A narcissistic person, though, struggles enormously to make that crucial distinction in their own mind. Their fragile self-image depends heavily on appearing successful, superior, highly intelligent, widely admired, or morally right at all times. Anything that threatens this carefully guarded image can feel completely unbearable to them. Rather than sitting quietly with uncomfortable feelings of imperfection, many narcissists instinctively raise heavy walls to protect themselves. Unfortunately, these defenses rarely look like genuine vulnerability. Instead, they often show up as sudden anger, harsh criticism, unfair blame, a need for control, or abrupt emotional withdrawal. For instance, if you gently confront them about lying to you, they may instantly accuse you of being paranoid and untrustworthy. If you express genuine sadness about how poorly they treated you, they may call you overly emotional or dramatic. If you set a healthy personal boundary, they may suddenly paint you as selfish or completely uncaring. These reactive shifts successfully pull attention away from their bad behavior and place the emotional weight right back on your shoulders. This toxic pattern is widely known as psychological projection. Instead of recognizing traits in themselves that they simply cannot accept, they unconsciously assign those exact traits to someone else. They may call you manipulative while they are actively manipulating you. They may accuse you of being controlling while trying to dominate every decision you make. They may insist you're being dishonest while hiding the truth from you themselves. For survivors, this creates massive mental confusion because it makes them question their very sense of reality. Over time, this creeping self-doubt becomes one of the most damaging and long-lasting effects of emotional abuse. Another common defense is the desperate need to hold onto absolute control over the dynamic. If acknowledging your pain would mean admitting they behaved unfairly, they may instead choose to ramp up their controlling behavior to regain the upper hand. This might look like giving you the silent treatment, criticizing your personal achievements, spreading false stories about you to others, or pulling your attention back in after long stretches of silence. None of these actions are proof that they've finally developed real empathy for you. More often, they're calculated attempts to restore the familiar emotional balance that protects them from facing uncomfortable truths about themselves. Understanding these reactions is incredibly empowering because it completely changes the kind of questions you ask yourself. Instead of sitting around wondering why they act this way toward you, you start asking what it is they're so desperately trying to avoid. That mental shift lets you stop taking every insult, every unfair accusation, and every calculated attempt to shake your self-confidence personally. Their frantic reactions become nothing more than information, not an accurate measure of your true worth as a person. Most importantly, spotting these repeating patterns gently reminds you that someone else's inability to face their own hidden shame should never become your job to fix or carry. You cannot heal another person by soaking up their toxic blame, accepting their projections, or sacrificing your own emotional well-being just to keep the peace. Real, lasting healing finally begins the moment you stop chasing understanding from the very person who caused the confusion in the first place, and instead start trusting the clarity that comes from educating yourself. The more deeply you understand these complicated emotional defenses, the less power they'll hold over your thoughts, your confidence, and your future happiness. One of the hardest truths to accept after leaving a narcissistic relationship is that someone can secretly feel brief flickers of shame without ever becoming accountable for the actual harm they caused. Many hopeful survivors hold on because they genuinely believe that if the narcissist just feels bad enough, a sincere apology will eventually show up out of nowhere. They picture a future day when the narcissist calls them up, admits everything they did wrong, acknowledges the deep pain, and finally offers the validation they've been longing for all along. This hope makes complete sense because healthy relationships teach us again and again that genuine remorse naturally leads to repair. When emotionally healthy people realize they've hurt someone they truly care about, they usually feel real empathy, take full responsibility, and make a sincere effort to change their hurtful behavior going forward. Deep down, they understand that love includes accountability. Unfortunately, narcissistic behavior almost always takes a very different and disappointing path. A narcissist may genuinely feel discomfort when they lose a relationship, damage their public image, or realize they no longer hold power over someone they once controlled. But that temporary discomfort doesn't automatically turn into real, mature responsibility. Instead of asking themselves how their bad behavior hurt the other person, they're far more likely to ask how the situation is affecting them personally. This key difference shows exactly where their emotional attention permanently sits. Their main concern is almost always focused squarely on the negative fallout they're experiencing rather than the deep pain someone else had to go through because of them. They may deeply miss the constant admiration, the endless attention, the daily convenience, or the control the relationship gave them. But that doesn't necessarily mean they've developed any real empathy for the person they mistreated along the way. This is exactly why so many survivors get deeply confused when a narcissist suddenly reaches out after months or even years of complete silence. The message might sound warm, nostalgic, or even somewhat apologetic on the surface. They might say they've been thinking about you a lot, that they truly miss you, or that they simply wish things had gone differently between the two of you. While these sweet-sounding words can feel deeply meaningful in the moment, it's critical to look past the language and pay attention to the underlying pattern of behavior. Does the conversation include specific accountability for past wrongs, or is it full of vague, empty statements? Do they clearly acknowledge your pain without making excuses? Or do they quickly steer the focus back to their own feelings and problems? Genuine accountability is always detailed, consistent over time, and paired with visibly changed behavior. Empty remorse, on the other hand, tends to be overly emotional in the moment, but disappears completely the second they regain a familiar sense of control over you. Another major reason accountability is so hard for narcissistic personalities is that admitting wrongdoing directly threatens the grand identity they've spent years building. They often see themselves mainly as the innocent victim, the heroic figure, the endlessly misunderstood one, or the person who is always treated unfairly by others. Accepting real responsibility would mean tearing down that comforting story and facing deeply uncomfortable truths about their own character. For someone whose entire self-worth rests on maintaining a flawless image, this can feel overwhelming and catastrophic. So instead, they rewrite history rather than face reality. They may claim you badly exaggerated what happened, insist that you somehow forced them to act that way through your own actions, or constantly bring up your past mistakes just to avoid talking about theirs. These defensive tactics protect their fragile self-image, but they completely block any real personal growth. For survivors, this hard truth can be heartbreaking because it means the closure they're looking for may never arrive in the way they originally pictured it. And yet, there's also an incredible sense of freedom in truly understanding this dynamic. Their total lack of accountability is never proof that your pain didn't matter. It's not evidence that your memories are wrong or that your feelings aren't valid. It's simply a clear reflection of someone else's deep emotional limitations and psychological blocks. Once you fully see this truth, you stop waiting for someone else to confirm what you already know deep down. You start trusting your own lived experience instead. Your ongoing healing no longer depends on hearing the words, "you were wrong," from their mouth. It depends on believing in yourself, honoring your unique journey, and recognizing that your inner peace is far too valuable to leave in the hands of someone completely unwilling to take responsibility for their own actions. That powerful realization marks the true beginning of your emotional independence. One of the most inspiring and powerful moments in your entire healing journey is when you finally start to change, not for the narcissist, not to prove a point to anyone, and not to win them back into your life, but purely for yourself. At first, this inner shift is usually quiet and low-key. You simply stop replying to every provocative message they send your way. You stop wasting energy defending yourself against their fabricated accusations. You stop explaining your personal boundaries over and over to someone who refuses to respect them anyway. You start putting your precious energy into your own well-being instead of constantly trying to manage their chaotic emotions for them. These personal changes may look small from the outside, but they represent a huge shift in the underlying emotional dynamic. The person who once fully depended on your reactions, your constant attention, and your emotional availability suddenly finds that their old manipulation tactics simply stop working. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, this can feel deeply unsettling because your ongoing healing becomes a clear mirror reflecting something they've spent years running from.